She was forced to marry her sister's millionaire fiancé in Coma. Then the unbelievable happened. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. The rain came down in sheets over a small Midwestern town, turning sidewalks into rivers of silver. Inside a dim cafe, a young woman named Clara Hayes sat hunched at the corner table, clutching the sleeves of her thrift store sweater. 23 years old, fresh out of community college, already buried under medical bills from her father's failing health. Every dollar she earned waiting tables at the diner went straight to hospital payments and groceries. There was no escape, no miracle on the horizon. Her phone buzzed. One glance at the name flashing on the screen, her mother and Clara's stomach tightened. She answered anyway. "Clara," her mother's voice trembled. "Come home. It's urgent." Minutes later, she stood in the living room of her family's worn-down house. Her uncle, his suit pressed too neatly for the neighborhood, leaned back on the couch with a look of grim authority. Beside him sat her mother, pale and anxious, twisting her hands together. "You know your sister Evelyn," the uncle began, his tone flat, "was engaged to Christopher Langford." Clara nodded cautiously. Everyone knew Christopher. Heir to the Langford fortune, young millionaire CEO. The engagement was splashed across every society magazine. He was in that accident 3 months ago, still in a coma. Evelyn has run away. She refuses to go through with the marriage. Clara's chest tightened. She whispered, "I don't understand. What does that have to do with me?" Her uncle leaned forward, eyes sharp. "The Langfords need a bride at the altar. A Langford heir cannot lie in a hospital bed unmarried. The board demands it. Your sister is gone. You will step in." The words struck like a slap. Clara stared at him, shaking her head. "You want me to marry a man who doesn't even know I exist? A man who can't say yes or no?" Her mother reached for her hand, tears in her eyes. "Clara, please. If you don't, they'll pull all financial support. Your father's treatments, everything will be gone. We can't afford it alone." The room spun. Her father's drawn face flashed in her mind, the machines keeping him alive. The overdue hospital bills stacked on the counter, the landlord's threats. She had no savings, no safety net, only this impossible demand. Her uncle placed a document on the table, a marriage contract, crisp and cold. Next to it, a velvet box containing 2 gold rings. "This isn't about love," he said firmly. "It's about survival. You sign, you marry him, and your family lives. Refuse, and you walk out of this house for good." Clara's lips parted, but no words came. Rain beat against the window, the only sound in the suffocating silence. She wanted to scream, to run, to tear the paper in half. But her mother's desperate eyes held her captive. She lowered her gaze to the contract, to the lifeless signature line waiting for her name. Her hand trembled as she reached for the pen. Outside, thunder rolled across the dark sky. Inside, with one small stroke of ink, Clara sealed a fate she never wanted. The marriage was set. A wedding without music, without laughter, without love. Only the echo of rain and the weight of a decision that would change her life forever. The courthouse smelled faintly of old wood and paper. On a gray Monday morning, Clara Hayes stood at the front of a nearly empty room, a borrowed white dress hanging awkwardly from her thin frame. Beside her, a lawyer flipped through the pages of the marriage contract, his voice flat as he read the terms. A notary sat stone, faced in the corner. There were no flowers, no music, no friends. Only silence, broken by the shuffle of papers. On the other side of the aisle, Christopher Langford lay motionless on a hospital bed that had been wheeled in under heavy guard. Machines hummed softly, keeping his body alive, his chest rising and falling in mechanical rhythm. He was handsome even in stillness. But his eyes remained closed, unaware of the woman now being bound to him by law. "Do you, Clara Hayes, consent to this marriage?" the officiant asked. Her voice caught. She glanced at her mother in the front row. Her mother's lips trembled as she mouthed the words, "Do it." Clara swallowed hard. I do." The officiant nodded briskly. Then by the authority vested in me by the state, you are hereby declared husband and wife. It was done, no kiss, no joy, just the echo of a gavel striking wood. That evening, Clara was driven through iron gates that creaked open to reveal the Langford estate. The mansion loomed ahead, a palace of stone and glass, lit by chandeliers, so bright they looked like fire trapped in crystal. Clara's stomach churned as the car stopped before the grand entrance. Inside, everything gleamed, marble floors polished to a mirror shine, staircases curling upward like something out of a royal palace. Staff lined the hall, their faces unreadable. Some glanced at her with thinly veiled disdain, as if they could smell the poverty on her thrift store shoes. "Welcome, Mrs. Langford," the head housekeeper said, the title dripping with irony. Her room was larger than the entire house she grew up in, yet it felt cold, lifeless. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked manicured gardens, but there was no warmth in the view. She dropped her small suitcase by the door and sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the gold ring now heavy on her finger. That night, unable to sleep, Clara wandered the halls. She followed the sound of faint beeping until she reached the private wing where Christopher lay. His suite was nothing like a hospital room. It was opulent, with velvet drapes, mahogany furniture, and machines discreetly tucked away as if illness itself had to be hidden. Clara stepped closer, her breath uneven. She stared at the man she now called husband. His jawline was sharp, his hair neatly trimmed, his skin pale under the dim lamp. Tubes and wires tethered him to life. She whispered, almost to herself, "We don't even know each other, and yet here I am." Her hand hovered near his, uncertain. For a moment, she imagined he could hear her, trapped somewhere behind closed eyes. She shook the thought away and pulled back, wrapping her arms around herself. The days that followed blurred together. Staff instructed her on etiquette, how to dress for dinner, how to greet guests, when to speak and when to stay silent. At every gathering, she felt like an imposter in borrowed silk. At the long dining table, she sat yards away from an empty chair reserved for Christopher, answering polite but probing questions from relatives who smiled without kindness. Still, when night fell, she always found herself drifting back to the quiet suite. She would sit beside his bed, listening to the steady heartbeat on the monitor. Sometimes she spoke about her father's illness, about how she missed the smell of pancakes from the diner, about the way rain on the windows made her feel less alone. "You probably can't hear a word," she whispered one night, fingers tracing the edge of his blanket. "But at least someone in this house listens." Her voice broke, and she pressed her hands to her face. She hadn't chosen this life, but somehow it had chosen her. And though he lay silent, she couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, deep inside, Christopher Langford was not entirely gone. And Clara had no idea that the stillness she feared so much was already beginning to shift. Dinner at the Langford estate was a ritual Clara never grew used to. The table stretched nearly 20 feet, covered in polished silver and crystal glasses. She sat at one end, her place setting perfect, her posture stiff. At the other end, the chair reserved for Christopher remained empty, a reminder of the man whose name she carried, but whose voice she had never heard. The staff served course after course, meals crafted by a private chef filet mignon, lobster bisque, vegetables cut with surgical precision. Clara forced down small bites, her throat tight. Around her, whispers drifted between Christopher's relatives. "Poor girl looks lost," one cousin murmured behind a raised wine glass. "She's just here for the money," another replied. Clara kept her eyes on her plate, pretending not to hear. But their voices sliced through her like knives. Later that evening, she excused herself and slipped away from the grandeur of the dining room. The marble floors echoed under her shoes as she walked the familiar path to Christopher's suite. Pushing open the door, she let out a slow breath. Here, at least, there were no stairs, no questions, no judgment. Only the steady rhythm of machines. She sank into the chair beside his bed. His face looked almost peaceful in the low light, framed by shadows and the faint glow of monitors. "You'd probably laugh if you knew what they were saying about me," she whispered. "They think I'm here for your money. But I didn't want this either. I just couldn't let my father's treatment stop." Her eyes stung, but she blinked hard, refusing to cry. She reached for the sketchbook she had carried since college, a cheap spiral notebook with doodles along the cover. She flipped it open, showing him the page she had drawn earlier. It was the garden outside the mansion, except in her drawing the flowers were alive, untamed, unlike the stiff perfection beyond the glass. "I always wanted to be an artist," she said softly. "Crazy, right? A waitress with dreams of painting. But every time I try, life reminds me I don't have the luxury." "Oh." She set the book on the nightstand, close to his hand, as if he might reach for it. Of course, he didn't move. He never moved. But just as she was about to rise, a faint twitch caught her eye. She froze, heart racing. His fingers, were they moving? She leaned closer, holding her breath. For a second, she was certain she saw them shift. "Christopher?" Her voice was a whisper of disbelief. No answer, only the steady beep of the monitor. She waited, staring at his hand until her eyes blurred, but it lay still once more. Finally, she shook her head, forcing a laugh that sounded too thin. "I must be imagining things," she said, pulling the blanket higher over his chest. "I'm losing my mind in this place." Still, the image of that small movement burned in her mind. Days turned into a week. Clara followed her routine meals with people who sneered behind her back, etiquette lessons from staff who judged her every step, and evenings spent alone in the suite. Each night, she swore she saw something different, a twitch of his eyelids, a shift of his jaw. She told herself it was nothing, wishful thinking, but her heart whispered otherwise. One evening, as rain lashed against the tall windows, she sat once more at his bedside. Her voice was tired but tender. "If you can hear me, if there's any part of you still in there, just know you're not alone. I don't care what anyone says. I'll sit here until you wake up, even if it takes forever." Her fingers brushed his, tentative and gentle. And this time, she felt it just the slightest pressure, the faintest squeeze. Clara's breath caught. She jerked her gaze to his face, eyes wide, searching for any sign. The monitor beeped steadily. His chest rose and fell as always. But his hand had held hers for a fraction of a second. Clara's heart pounded. She clutched his hand tighter, whispering with trembling lips, "You're in there. I know you are." And in the silence of that vast, cold room, something shifted. For the first time, Clara felt she wasn't entirely alone. Morning sunlight spilled through the enormous windows of the Langford estate, painting the marble floors in pale gold. Clara hadn't slept. She sat in the chair beside Christopher's bed, her sketchbook open but forgotten on her lap. All she could think about was the way his hand had closed over hers, however faintly, the night before. It couldn't have been her imagination. She replayed it again and again, the warmth of his palm, the subtle pressure of his fingers. She wanted to tell someone, to shout it through the echoing halls. But she already knew what would happen. They'd dismiss her, accuse her of hysteria, or worse, say she was clinging to fantasies to justify her place in the mansion. At breakfast, her suspicions came true. She sat at the table, forcing down bites of toast, while the Langford relatives exchanged smug smiles. A sharp-tongued aunt leaned across the table, her pearls gleaming. "You look tired, Clara. Perhaps the guilt of your little arrangement is finally catching up with you?" Clara stiffened. "I don't know what you mean." The aunt's smile was cold. "Oh, come now. Everyone knows why you're here. Evelyn ran away, and the family needed a substitute. Convenient, isn't it, that the poor waitress suddenly became Mrs. Langford?" The others chuckled softly, their knives and forks scraping the china. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Believe what you want," she said quietly. "I'm not here for your approval." Laughter rippled down the table, sharp and cruel. Clara pushed her plate away and stood. "Excuse me." Back in Christopher's suite, she closed the door behind her, her chest tight. The room, once a sanctuary, now felt like the only place she could breathe. She moved to his bedside, brushing her fingers across the back of his hand. "They hate me," she admitted softly. "They think I'm a thief, a liar. But you know the truth, don't you?" For a moment, nothing. Then, impossibly, his fingers twitched again. Clara gasped, clutching his hand in both of hers. "You hear me?" she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "I know you do." The following days only deepened her conviction. Each night she returned, speaking to him in hushed tones. And each night the signs grew stronger, a flicker of his eyelids, a faint movement of his jaw. It was as though he was fighting his way back, inch by inch, drawn by the sound of her voice. One evening, she leaned close, her lips near his ear. "Christopher, it's Clara. I don't know if you understand, but I'm your wife now. I never wanted this, but I'm here. And if you come back, I promise you won't be alone." The monitor beeped steadily, his chest rose and fell. Then, suddenly, his hand squeezed hers again. Stronger this time. Clara froze, heart hammering. She stared at his face, and her breath caught. His eyelids fluttered. "Christopher?" Her voice was barely audible. His eyes opened. Slowly, painfully, but undeniably they opened. Clara staggered back, one hand over her mouth. His gaze was unfocused, his lips dry, but he was awake. Alive. A nurse burst in at that moment, tray in hand, and nearly dropped it. "Oh my God," she whispered. "He's conscious." Within minutes, the room filled doctors, staff, relatives, rushing to witness the miracle. Clara was pushed to the side as machines were checked, vitals read, charts updated. Everyone spoke at once, chaos flooding the air. But through the noise, his eyes found hers. For the briefest second, their gazes locked. Confusion, yes, but also recognition, as though some part of him remembered her voice in the endless dark. And then, with a rasping breath, Christopher Langford spoke his first words in months. His voice was weak but clear, his question directed straight at her. "Who are you?" The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Clara. She opened her mouth, but no sound came. She was his wife in name, his caretaker in truth. But how could she explain any of it now? Her heart pounded as the weight of his words sank in. For the first time, she realized waking up was only the beginning. The hardest part of this marriage was yet to come. The Langford estate hadn't felt this alive in months. Nurses hurried through the halls. Doctors whispered urgently over clipboards, and the family hovered like moths drawn to sudden light. Word had spread Christopher Langford was awake. The heir who had lain silent for nearly a year had opened his eyes. But for Clara, the miracle was tangled with dread. His first words still echoed in her mind. "Who are you?" She lingered at the edge of his suite, watching as doctors performed basic checks. Christopher's voice was hoarse, his movements weak, but every flicker of awareness seemed to astonish the staff. A cousin clapped one of the doctors on the back, laughing as if the recovery was his own triumph. No one looked at her, not even Christopher. When the room finally cleared, Clara dared to step closer. He sat propped against pillows, his face pale but alert, his eyes sharper now than when they had first opened. He studied her as if she were a puzzle piece that didn't fit. "You've been here," he said slowly, his voice raw. "I remember, a voice, always talking. Was that you?" Clara clasped her hands in front of her. "Yes, I stayed by your side." His gaze narrowed. "Why? Who put you here?" Her throat tightened. She wanted to tell him everything, that she hadn't wanted this, that she was only trying to save her family, that she hadn't lied about who she was. But the words stuck. The truth was heavy, dangerous. Before she could answer, the door opened. The sharp-tongued aunt swept in, trailed by two other relatives. "Christopher, darling," she crooned, her false warmth filling the room. "We are so relieved. You cannot imagine our joy." He forced a smile, nodding faintly. Then his eyes slid back to Clara. "And her?" he asked, his tone cool. "Who exactly is she?" The aunt's gaze flicked to Clara, her lips curling. "Oh, haven't they told you? She's your wife." The family saw to it when Evelyn left. Silence dropped like a stone. Christopher's eyes widened, then darkened. "My wife?" Clara's chest burned. She tried to speak, but the aunt's laughter cut her off. "Yes, imagine that. The waitress who used to serve pie at the diner is now Mrs. Langford. A pity you weren't awake for the vows, but needs must." Christopher's expression hardened, his jaw clenching as he turned back to Clara. "Is that true?" She nodded, her voice breaking. "I didn't want to deceive you. They forced me my father's hospital bills." But he had already looked away, staring at the ceiling as if it might give him answers. The silence between them stretched, cold and unyielding. That night, Clara sat in her room, the mansion pressing in on her like a prison. She stared at the contract, still folded in her drawer, the ink of her signature mocking her. She had saved her family, yes. But now she had chained herself to a man who saw her as a stranger, perhaps even an enemy. She thought of leaving, of packing her bag and slipping out before dawn. But every time the thought grew strong, another memory pushed in the faint squeeze of his hand, the way his eyes had searched for hers in the chaos. Somewhere inside, he remembered her. Maybe not her face, maybe not her name, but her presence. And that was enough to keep her rooted. Days passed, and Christopher's strength returned in small increments. He walked with assistance, spoke more clearly, began sitting in on brief meetings with the family board. Clara remained on the margins, neither welcomed nor dismissed, a ghost in the halls of her own marriage. But at night, when the mansion quieted, she still went to him. She brought her sketchbook, showed him drawings of the gardens, the rain, even of him as she had seen him in sleep. Sometimes he looked away, guarded. Other times, his gaze softened, just for a second. One evening, as she closed the book, he finally spoke. "You could have left. Why didn't you?" Clara swallowed hard. "Because no one else stayed. Because, even if it was forced, I made a vow, and I couldn't break it, not while you were alone." For the first time since he woke, his expression cracked not with anger, but something closer to wonder. He didn't reply, but his silence was no longer cold. It was thoughtful. Clara left the suite that night with her heart trembling. For the first time, she dared to believe that the impossible marriage forced upon her might be turning into something real. The first public appearance came sooner than Clara expected. Barely 3 weeks after waking, Christopher insisted on attending a Langford Foundation gala. Doctors cautioned against it, but he was determined. "If I don't show my face," he said, adjusting his cufflinks with hands still shaky, "they'll think I'm weak, and weakness invites vultures." The ballroom glittered that evening, chandeliers casting gold over rows of tables dressed in silk, cameras flashing as donors arrived in black suits and sequined gowns. Clara followed a step behind Christopher, her borrowed evening dress clinging awkwardly, every pair of eyes on her. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "That's her, the substitute bride, the waitress." Christopher greeted guests with practiced charm, but Clara noticed the stiffness in his jaw, the weight of every handshake. When reporters pressed closer, one voice cut through the din. "Mr. Langford, who is the young woman at your side? Rumors say she married you while you were in a coma. Is it true?" The question struck like lightning. The ballroom hushed. Christopher froze, his eyes darting toward her. For a heartbeat, Clara thought he might deny her, cast her aside before everyone. Her pulse hammered in her ears. But then, slowly, he reached for her hand. His grip was firm, steady, nothing like the fragile touches of the hospital. He looked straight at the cameras. "Yes, this is my wife, Clara Langford. She stood by me when no one else did. That is all anyone needs to know." Gasps rippled across the room. The reporters scrambled, questions flying, but Christopher moved past them with Clara still at his side. Later, away from the crowd, he sank into a chair, exhausted. Clara hovered uncertainly until he glanced up at her. His voice was quiet, stripped of bravado. "I don't know why I said that. But it felt true." Clara's chest tightened. "Because it is true," she whispered. In the days that followed, something shifted between them. Christopher invited her to walk the gardens with him in the mornings, his steps slow but growing stronger. He asked about her sketches, studying the drawings with surprising interest. Once, catching her laughing at one of his dry remarks, he smiled back a small, unguarded smile that made her breath catch. But the closer they grew, the more dangerous the shadows around them became. One evening, Clara overheard voices in the study. Christopher's uncle and 2 board members stood in tense conversation. "She's a liability," one muttered. "A girl from nowhere tied to his name? Investors are already asking questions." "We can't undo the marriage," another said sharply. "The press would eat us alive." The uncle's voice cut in, colder than the rest. "Then, we make sure she walks away on her own." Clara pressed a hand to her mouth, heart pounding. She backed away before they saw her, slipping into the dark hall. For the first time, fear settled like ice in her chest, not for herself, but for Christopher. If they wanted her gone, they might not stop at whispers. That night, she told him what she'd heard. He listened, expression unreadable. When she finished, he leaned forward, eyes steady on hers. "They underestimate you," he said quietly. "They think you'll break. But I've seen the way you stayed when you had every reason to leave. They can't take that away from us. Us." The word echoed in Clara's mind long after she left his room. But even as warmth bloomed in her chest, the storm outside their fragile bond gathered strength. The Langford empire was full of secrets, and Clara was beginning to realize that her forced marriage had pulled her into a battle much larger and far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The storm broke a week later. It began with a headline splashed across every business paper: "Langford heir's sham marriage exposed." Grainy photos of Clara at the diner were plastered beside her wedding certificate, leaked directly from the family archives. The article claimed she'd schemed her way into the fortune, taking advantage of a man in a coma. By noon, the story had gone viral. When Clara stepped out of her room, servants avoided her eyes. By evening, the whispers had turned into outright stares. At dinner, Christopher's aunt slammed her wine glass down. "This is what happens when you let a nobody into our house," she spat. "The board wants her gone. If you don't annul this farce, Christopher, you'll lose everything." Clara's fork clattered against her plate. She looked to Christopher, searching for reassurance, but his face was pale and tight. "Is this true?" he asked quietly. "Did they force you into this marriage?" Her throat closed. She wanted to shout the truth, that she hadn't chosen this, that she was cornered, desperate, trying to save her father. But before she could speak, the aunt shoved a file across the table. Bank statements, photos, doctored evidence, suggesting Clara had been paid off. "She's been lying to you," the aunt hissed. "A waitress who saw her chance and took it. Do the right thing. End it." Christopher rose from the table, his chair scraping the marble. For a long, terrible moment, he stared at Clara. His eyes, once softening, now burned with anger and betrayal. "I need the truth," he said, his voice low. "Right now." Tears blurred her vision. "I never wanted this," she whispered. "I was forced, Christopher. My father, his treatments, if I refused, they would have let him die. I signed because I had no choice." But he was already turning away, his jaw set. "You should have told me from the start." He left the room, the echo of his footsteps lingering long after he was gone. Alone at the table, Clara's chest collapsed under the weight of it all. She had fought through scorn, whispers, and loneliness. But this Christopher's doubt cut deeper than anything else. That night, she packed her small suitcase, the same one she had carried into the estate weeks earlier. Her fingers lingered on the gold ring she wore, heavy now with broken promises. She slid it off and set it gently on the nightstand beside her sketchbook. "Maybe this was all it was ever meant to be," she whispered into the darkness. For the first time, Clara allowed herself to imagine walking away for good. Rain hammered the city the next morning as Clara slipped out of the Langford estate with her suitcase in hand. No driver, no guards, just a solitary figure walking away from marble gates that had never felt like home. The cold drops soaked through her coat, but the ache in her chest was heavier than the storm. She told herself this was the end. She had done her part, endured the whispers, kept her vow as long as she could. Now it was time to disappear. But across town, Christopher Langford sat in a boardroom filled with restless shareholders. His uncle's voice carried over the polished table. "The marriage is a liability. Annul it, Christopher, or you'll lose control of the company." Christopher leaned back, eyes shadowed from a sleepless night. He remembered Clara's trembling voice, the way she confessed she had no choice, that she'd stayed by his side when everyone else walked away. And then he remembered the aunt's words, dripping with venom, twisting everything Clara had done. "Do you think I don't know what you're doing?" Christopher said suddenly, his voice cutting through the room. "Leaking stories, planting evidence, turning my life into a scandal?" The board members shifted uncomfortably. His uncle's face tightened. "This is business, Christopher. She was never meant to last." Christopher stood, shoulders squared, despite the weakness still lingering in his body. "She lasted when none of you did. When I was in that bed, she was the only one who stayed. That's not weakness. That's strength. And if any of you think I'll cast her aside to protect your pride, you've forgotten who I am." The room fell silent. Shareholders exchanged uneasy glances, but Christopher didn't wait for their approval. He turned and walked out, a decision blazing in his chest. That evening, Clara sat in a tiny cafe near the bus station, her suitcase at her feet, her sketchbook open in front of her. She stared at the page without seeing it, lost in the hollow silence of goodbye. The bell over the door chimed. She didn't look up until a shadow fell across her table. Running away? Her heart stilled. Christopher stood there, rain dripping from his coat, his eyes fixed on her. "I thought it was what you wanted," she whispered. "You looked at me like I was a stranger." He pulled out the chair opposite her and sat, never breaking her gaze. "I was angry, hurt, but then I realized everything I know about loyalty. I learned from you. You stayed when you had no reason to. You told me the truth when everyone else lied. That means more than the lies they've fed me." Clara's eyes blurred with tears. "Christopher, He reached across the table, taking her hand firmly in his. "No more contracts? No more conditions? If you'll give me the chance, I want this marriage to be real." The cafe buzzed softly around them, but to Clara, the world had gone silent. For the first time, there was no weight of obligation, no threats hanging over her. Only choice. Only him. And slowly, through tears, she whispered, "Yes." 2 months later, the Langford estate looked nothing like the cold palace Clara had first stepped into. The halls were filled with fresh flowers. The staff greeted her with genuine warmth, and for the first time, laughter echoed off the marble walls. The change hadn't come from the chandeliers or the wealth. It had come from Christopher. Their second wedding was nothing like the first. Gone was the sterile courthouse, the contract, the lifeless ceremony. This time, the vows were spoken under an arch of roses in the estate gardens, sunlight spilling across rows of guests who cheered as if the world had finally righted itself. Clara wore a simple gown she had chosen herself, and Christopher stood tall at her side, no longer pale or broken, but alive, his eyes never leaving hers. When the officiant asked if he took Clara as his wife, his voice was strong. "I do freely, and with all that I am." And when Clara answered, her voice trembled not from fear, but from joy. "I do, with my whole heart." As applause rose around them, Christopher reached into his pocket and pulled out the ring she had once left behind on the nightstand. But this time, it was joined by another, a new band, gleaming in the sunlight. He slid it onto her finger and whispered so only she could hear, "No more contracts, only love." Clara's tears fell freely as he kissed her, sealing not an arrangement, but a promise. After the ceremony, they walked hand in hand through the garden. Guests lingered, but for Clara, the world had narrowed to the warmth of his palm and the steady certainty in his smile. "You know," Christopher said, glancing at her with a grin, "I used to think the most unbelievable part of my life was waking up from that coma. But I was wrong." She looked up at him, curious. "Then what was it?" His voice softened. "That in all the chaos, all the lies, the one thing I found was you." The words sank into her heart like sunlight after a storm. For the first time since the day she'd signed her name on that cold contract, Clara felt free, not trapped, not forced, but chosen. As evening fell, lanterns lit the garden, and music carried into the night. Christopher pulled her into a slow dance beneath the stars, the ring glinting on her hand as she rested it against his chest. And in that moment, Clara knew. The marriage that had begun as an impossible bargain had become the greatest gift of her life. Their story, once born in silence and shadows, had ended in love, a love that was real, undeniable, and forever.